The sky darkened in an ominous gray, and the first crack of thunder shattered the eerie silence. What had been a warm, pleasant afternoon turned into chaos as a torrential downpour descended upon the small, sleepy town. Streets once bustling with life were deserted, save for the occasional flash of headlights cutting through the sheets of rain. Trees bent and swayed under the force of the gusting wind, their branches snapping like brittle twigs. Amid the cacophony of the storm, a lone dog padded through the empty streets. His fur was matted with mud, and his thin frame spoke of many days spent scavenging for scraps. He had no name and no home, a stray surviving on instinct and sheer will. To the townsfolk, he was just another shadow in the background, a creature of little consequence. But tonight, this nameless dog would become something much more. On the outskirts of town, where the paved roads gave way to dense woods, little Sophie clung to a broken tree trunk, her small hands trembling from cold and fear. At just 8 years old, she had wandered too far during her family's picnic, chasing the fluttering wings of a butterfly. When the storm rolled in, she lost her way amidst the towering trees and tangled underbrush. Her cries for help were swallowed by the howling wind, and the darkness pressed in around her like a suffocating blanket. Rain soaked through her clothes, chilling her to the bone. She tried to remember the way back, but every direction looked the same. She tripped and fell repeatedly, her knees scraped and bleeding, until she could move no further. Sophie sank to the ground, her sobs mingling with the roar of the storm, certain no one would hear her. But someone did. The dog, drawn by the faintest sound of her cries, followed the trail of her scent through the rain-soaked air. His ears perked, his steps quickening as the whimpering grew louder. When he finally broke through the brush and saw the small, shivering figure curled up beneath the tree, something stirred within him, something primal, an instinct beyond survival. He approached cautiously, his amber eyes reflecting a mix of curiosity and concern. Sophie froze, her wide, tear-filled eyes meeting his. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, two lost souls bound by their shared helplessness. Then, as if sensing her fear, the dog lay down a few feet away, lowering his head to the ground to show he meant no harm. When Sophie didn't move, he crawled closer, inch by inch, until his wet nose nudged her hand. Startled, she flinched but didn't pull away. Instead, she reached out hesitantly, her small fingers tangling in his damp fur. The warmth of his body was a lifeline in the cold, and the soft thump of his wagging tail was the first sign of hope she'd felt all evening. Unbeknownst to Sophie, this unassuming creature was about to become her guardian, her guide, and her hero in the darkest night of her young life. Together they would face the storm and embark on a journey neither would ever forget. The storm raged on, unrelenting. The wind whipped through the trees, tearing at the leaves and sending branches crashing to the ground. Sophie clung to the dog's thick fur, her small frame trembling as the chill seeped deeper into her bones. Her teeth chattered, and her sobs had turned to weak, hiccuping breaths. The dog seemed to sense her fragility. He nudged her again with his nose, his amber eyes watching her intently, as if urging her to get up. When she didn't move, he let out a soft whine, stood, and gently tugged at the hem of her soaked dress with his teeth. Sophie understood. I can't," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the storm. But the dog didn't relent. He tugged again, more insistent this time, and barked, a sharp, commanding sound that startled her into action. She struggled to her feet, her legs wobbly and weak, but the dog stayed close, pressing against her side as if to steady her. He took a step forward, then another, looking back each time to make sure she was following. Sophie didn't know where he was leading her, but she felt a flicker of trust in her chest, a faint spark of hope. Together they began to move through the dense forest, the dog navigating with an uncanny certainty. Sophie stumbled often, her feet catching on roots and rocks hidden beneath the mud. Each time, the dog paused, waiting patiently until she could regain her footing. The forest was a maze of shadows and sounds, creaking branches, rustling leaves, the relentless drumming of rain. Every now and then, Sophie thought she saw glowing eyes watching them from the darkness, but the dog didn't falter. His presence was a shield, his quiet confidence enough to keep her terror at bay. Hours seemed to pass as they trudged through the storm, though Sophie had no sense of time. Exhaustion weighed heavily on her, and her steps grew slower, her breaths more labored. The dog noticed her faltering pace and stopped, looking up at her with concern. He circled back, nudging her legs and licking her muddy hands as if to urge her onward. "I'm so tired," Sophie murmured, tears streaming down her face. She sank to her knees, too weary to continue. The dog barked again, more forcefully this time, and ran a few paces ahead before turning to face her. His eyes seemed to plead with her, and Sophie felt a strange determination rise within her. With a trembling hand, she pushed herself up. "Okay," she said softly. "Okay, I'll try." As they pressed on, the terrain began to change. The dense trees gave way to a small clearing, and in the distance, a faint light flickered through the rain, a beacon of hope. Sophie gasped, her heart leaping. "Lights!" she cried, her voice breaking with relief. The dog wagged his tail, his energy renewed by her excitement. He barked, a joyous sound that cut through the storm, and began to lead her toward the light. But the journey wasn't over yet. The clearing was separated from the source of the light by a fast-moving stream swollen from the relentless rain. The current was strong, its icy water churning with debris. Sophie froze at the edge, panic gripping her. "I can't cross that," she whispered, her voice trembling. The dog paced at her side, his ears flicking back and forth as he studied the stream. Then, as if making a decision, he stepped into the water. It swirled around his legs, but he stood firm, turning back to bark at her. "You want me to follow you?" Sophie asked, her voice small and uncertain. The dog barked again, an unmistakable command. Taking a deep breath, Sophie stepped into the icy stream. The cold was like 1,000 needles stabbing at her skin, and the current nearly swept her off her feet. She screamed, but the dog was there, his sturdy frame braced against the current. He pressed against her, guiding her step by step. Together, they inched across the stream, the dog never leaving her side. When they finally reached the other bank, Sophie collapsed onto the ground, her body shaking from exertion and cold. The dog licked her face, his tail wagging furiously, as if to say, "You did it." For the first time that night, Sophie smiled through her tears. She wrapped her arms around the dog's neck, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you," she said. "You saved me." The dog barked softly, his tail thumping against the muddy ground. But he wasn't done yet. The light was closer now, and he nudged her again, urging her to keep going. There was still a little more to endure before the storm would pass. Sophie's small body ached with every step, her energy nearly spent. The cold clung to her like a second skin, and her soaked clothes felt heavy and suffocating. Yet, every time she faltered, the dog was there, his determined bark, his steady presence, and his unwavering companionship a lifeline in the storm. The faint light they had spotted earlier grew brighter with every step. Sophie clung to the hope it promised, imagining the warmth and safety that must lie just beyond its glow. She didn't know where the dog was leading her, but she trusted him completely now. He had saved her once. She believed he would do it again. The rain began to ease, the sheets of water thinning into a steady drizzle. Sophie tilted her face to the sky, feeling the faintest touch of relief as the wind softened. The forest, though still dark, seemed less menacing now. The dog walked ahead with renewed purpose, his nose low to the ground as he followed an invisible trail. Suddenly he stopped, his ears perking up. Sophie froze, her heart pounding as she looked around. The dog let out a low growl, his body tense. She followed his gaze and saw movement in the shadows, a figure emerging from the trees. For a terrifying moment, Sophie thought it might be some wild animal, drawn by her vulnerability. But, as the figure drew closer, she realized it was a person, a man in a raincoat, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Hello?" the man called out, his voice rough but urgent. "Is someone there?" Sophie's heart leapt in her chest. "Here!" she cried, her voice cracking. "I'm here!" The man rushed forward, his flashlight beam landing on Sophie's pale, tear-streaked face. Relief washed over him as he crouched down. "Thank God," he breathed. "We've been looking for you everywhere. Your parents are worried sick." Sophie blinked up at him, her body swaying from exhaustion. "They're looking for me?" she whispered, as if the idea was too overwhelming to process. "Of course they are," the man said gently, wrapping his coat around her shivering form. "Let's get you back to them." He glanced at the dog, who stood protectively by her side, his fur bristling slightly. "And who's this brave fellow?" Sophie managed a weak smile, her hand resting on the dog's head. "He saved me," she said simply. The man nodded, his expression softening. "Looks like you've got yourself a guardian angel." The dog wagged his tail, his tense posture relaxing as he seemed to sense the danger was over. The man lifted Sophie into his arms, careful not to jostle her injured knees, and began to carry her toward the light. The dog followed closely, never letting her out of his sight. As they broke through the last line of trees, Sophie gasped. A group of people stood in the clearing, their flashlights waving frantically. When they saw the man carrying her, a collective cry of relief went up. "Sophie!" Her mother and father ran forward, tears streaming down their faces. Her mother wrapped her arms around her tightly, sobbing into her hair, while her father stroked her wet, muddy cheek. "We thought we lost you," her father choked out. I was lost," Sophie said, her voice trembling. "But he found me." She pointed to the dog, who stood a few steps away, watching the reunion with quiet dignity. The crowd turned their attention to the dog, murmuring in awe. Someone tried to approach him, but he backed away, his ears flattening. He wasn't used to attention, to kindness. He had lived his life in the shadows, unnoticed and unloved. But Sophie wouldn't let him slip away. She wiggled out of her mother's embrace and knelt in front of him, her hands on his muddy fur. "Don't go," she whispered. "You're my hero." The dog seemed to understand. He licked her face, his tail wagging slowly, and for the first time, His eyes held a spark of something more than survival. Connection. As the rescuers prepared to take Sophie home, she refused to let go of her savior. "He comes with me," she insisted, her voice firm despite her exhaustion. "He saved my life. He's my family now." No one could argue with her. How could they, after witnessing the bond between them? The dog had done more than lead her out of the storm. He had become her strength when she had none, her hope when all seemed lost. And now he would have a home, a name, and a place where he belonged. As they made their way back to town, Sophie clung to her newfound companion, her heart full despite the cold and exhaustion. She had been saved, not just by a stray dog, but by an extraordinary act of loyalty and love. And in saving her, he had found something, too, a reason to never wander alone again. The storm had passed, but its impact lingered in Sophie's small town. News of the little girl's miraculous survival spread quickly, and so did the tale of her unexpected rescuer. Strangers came to see the hero dog, though he was wary of the attention, staying close to Sophie's side at all times. Back home, Sophie insisted he be part of their family. Her parents, overwhelmed with gratitude for his role in bringing her back to them, agreed without hesitation. "He's earned his place here," her father said, his voice thick with emotion. Sophie named him Max, a simple, strong name for the dog who had shown her unwavering strength and courage. Max adjusted quickly to his new life. No longer a stray, he now had a warm bed, regular meals, and most importantly, a family that adored him. He never left Sophie's side, following her everywhere with the same devotion that had guided her through the storm. The scars on Sophie's knees healed, but the memory of that night stayed with her. At school, she told her classmates about her brave dog who wouldn't give up on her. Her story inspired others, even adults, to view stray animals differently. People who once ignored them began to see them as potential companions, capable of loyalty and love. Months passed, and Max became a local legend. He accompanied Sophie to community events and played with neighborhood children. People who had once shooed stray dogs away now left bowls of food and water out for them. Sophie's story had awakened something in the town, a deeper sense of compassion for those who were often overlooked. But Sophie and Max's bond went far beyond the town's admiration. They understood each other in a way words could never capture. Sophie, who had been timid and unsure before the storm, grew bolder, her spirit strengthened by Max's unwavering presence. And Max, who had spent his life surviving on the fringes, blossomed in the warmth of her love. One bright spring morning, Sophie's family took a walk to the edge of the woods where she and Max had first met. The storm's destruction was long gone, replaced by new growth. Trees that had been stripped of their leaves now stood tall and green, and wildflowers carpeted the forest floor. Sophie knelt beside Max, scratching behind his ears. "This is where you saved me," she said softly. "Do you remember?" Max wagged his tail, leaning into her touch. He didn't need to remember. He carried that night with him in his heart, just as she did. Sophie looked up at her parents, then back at Max. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "that night wasn't just about me being lost. Max was lost too. We found each other." Her father smiled, kneeling down beside them. "You're right," he said, his voice filled with pride. "Sometimes the greatest rescues aren't about one saving the other. They're about saving each other." Sophie hugged Max tightly, her heart swelling with gratitude. "We're a team now," she whispered. And they were. From that day on, Sophie and Max became symbols of hope, resilience, and the power of kindness. Together, they taught everyone around them that even in the darkest storms, light can be found. And sometimes, it comes in the form of an unlikely hero. Max's journey had started as a stray with no name, but now he was so much more. He was Sophie's protector, her best friend, and her family. He was proof that even the smallest, most forgotten among us can change the world for the better, one act of courage and love at a time. Their story was a reminder to everyone who heard it. Never underestimate the power of compassion. It can transform lives, build unbreakable bonds, and create new beginnings for both the lost and the found. If this heartwarming tale of courage and compassion moved you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Stories of Brilliance, where every story inspires and uplifts.